For thousands of years, humans have invented ways to propel themselves through water. But long before humans invented their propulsion systems, nature developed its own methods of moving through liquid space, not only in fish and other large aquatic creatures, but in organisms so tiny they cannot be seen by the naked eye. Perhaps the most amazing propulsion system on our entire planet is one that exists in bacteria. It's called the flagellum, a miniature propeller driven by a motor with many distinct mechanical parts, each made of proteins. The flagellum's motor resembles a human-designed rotary engine. It has a universal joint, bushings, a stator, and a rotor. It has a drive shaft and even its own clutch and braking system. In some bacteria, the flagellar motor has been clocked at 100,000 revolutions per minute. The motor is bidirectional and can shift from forward to reverse almost instantaneously. Some scientists suggest it operates at near 100% energy efficiency. All of this is done on a microscopic scale that is hard to imagine. The diameter of the flagellum motor is no more than 5 millionths of a centimeter. The bacterial flagellum is one of many molecular machines that scientists have discovered in the last several decades, including energy-producing turbines, information copying machines, and even robotic walking motors. The origin of these exquisite examples of nanotechnology is a mystery that has generated heated controversy among biologists over the past 2 decades. And it's a mystery that has transformed one man into a scientific rebel, willing to challenge one of the most cherished ideas of the scientific establishment. Biologist Michael Behe is an unlikely figure for a revolutionary.
I never was interested in stirring up the pot just for fun. I'm basically shy. I don't like to give anybody unnecessary trouble.
A mild-mannered professor at Lehigh University, Behe received his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Pennsylvania, one of America's top research universities. He spent his early career as a member of the scientific establishment, publishing peer-reviewed articles in science journals and receiving research funding from the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. But by the early 1990s, Behe was toying with heresy.
Another aspect of my personality is that I'm stubborn. If I see something and I mention it and nobody has a good reason that they can answer me with, I'll stick with it. And especially in this area. I'm a scientist. I'm supposed to want to know how biochemical systems came to be.
Behe found himself with growing doubts about one of the central tenets of modern biology, Darwinian evolution. According to the modern version of Darwin's theory, known as neo-Darwinism, even the most complicated biological features originated through a process of natural selection, sifting through random mutations or copying errors in the genetic instructions stored in DNA. For example, a random genetic mutation might give a particular bird a slightly longer beak. This small change could help the bird survive better, and eventually its offspring with longer beaks would come to dominate the population. A longer beak size might not seem all that important, But Darwinian theory asserts that over time, many similar unintended changes could accumulate, ultimately producing an organism radically different from its original ancestor. According to neo-Darwinism, new species and new biological features do not develop according to an intelligent plan. Instead, they arose from the accumulation of thousands of small, undirected genetic mistakes over millions of years. The more Michael Behe studied the staggering complexity of life at the biochemical level, the harder he found it to believe the standard Darwinian story. The bacterial flagellum was one of the biochemical systems that fueled Behe's skepticism.
The bacterial flagellum is literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It uses a little piece that spins round and around and around and pushes against the water just like a propeller does in an ordinary outboard motor on a boat in our everyday world. And the propeller is attached to a drive shaft, which is attached to a motor, which has clamps holding it in place, and dozens of pieces that are required for it to do its job. It's just a fantastic example of what science has discovered, and that is molecular machines.
The first time Behe saw a diagram of the flagellum, he was captivated.
I looked at it and says, wow, that's really fascinating. I wonder how that evolved. And then I'd turn the page and say, go on, do something else. And any skepticism was defeated by assuming that somebody must know this, because everybody says Darwin's theory is true.
But then Behe read a book by geneticist Michael Denton. Denton argued that Darwinian theory was in crisis because its mechanism of random mutation and natural selection wasn't capable of producing major biological innovations. After reading Denton, Behe's doubts about the origin of molecular machines like the flagellum grew.
Then I went back and said, well, who does know how this could have evolved? And nobody had anything to say about it. Even hand-waving speculations were hard to find.
Behe began to dig deeper to find an answer.
Darwin's theory says you have to start with something that's working a little bit, and then it will change, mutate a bit, and that helps a little bit, and that'll be selected, and then improve a little bit more and a little bit more until you get the full-fledged system. And I said, well, it does not look like some of these systems can be done that way, because they need all of these parts. You know, if you don't have this one, it's not going to work. You can't take any of the parts away. I was kind of sitting at my desk scratching my head. You can't take the parts away. You can't reduce it at all. It's irreducible, and it's irreducibly complex. I thought, bingo, that encapsulates the problem for Darwin's theory right there.
Behe decided to write a book explaining his heretical ideas. Published during the summer of 1996, Darwins Black Box quickly attracted attention. Darwin supporters had insisted that there were no credible scientific objections to Darwin's theory. But now a scientist at a mainstream American university was saying otherwise.
My editor called from Free Press, and he says, okay, the book's going to be out at the beginning of August, and the New York Times is going to do a review, the week before.
It was reviewed everywhere. The New York Times, National Review, Nature, technical science journals, popular publications. The term itself, irreducible complexity, entered the lexicon, where it's still very alive. It's become part of the scientific descriptive toolkit, if you will.
At that point, I realized that, I had gotten into something I had not anticipated. It got a lot more discussion than I had ever dreamed about.
The bacterial flagellum was one of the central examples of irreducible complexity Behe highlighted in his book.
If you take away the propeller, if you take away the motor, if you take away the clamps that hold it onto the cell's membrane, take away any of a number of different parts, it's not that the flagellum is going to spin half as fast as it used to, or a quarter. It's broken. It doesn't work at all. It's like taking the propeller off of a of an outboard motor on your boat and wondering how far now you can go in the water. You can't go anywhere. So that's a problem for Darwin's theory, because Darwin's theory says that things evolve by working a little bit, maybe not very well, but a little bit, and then a mutation, a change comes along that helps it work a little bit better, and that helps the organism survive and have more offspring. And so then another change comes along, and another, and it gradually builds up to the final structure. Well, that might work for some things, but it doesn't work for systems that are irreducibly complex, things like the bacterial flagellum. Because, well, if you wanted to build an outboard motor for a boat, what would you start with? Would you start with, say, just an iron rod that, in the future would attach a motor to the propeller? Well, what's that going to do? It's not going to do anything. Would you start with just a propeller? Well, that's not going to do anything. It's not attached to anything. Would you start with just the motor? Well, that's not going to propel you anywhere. So with irreducibly complex systems like the flagellum, Darwin's idea is dead in the water, like a boat with an outboard motor that doesn't work.
Natural selection selects or favors in variations that confer a functional advantage on a system. Many of the simpler versions that you could imagine of the bacterial flagellar motor perform no function at all. And so if you imagine trying to build a flagellar motor, adding parts one by one until you finally get to the complete system, you're going to encounter configurations of parts that confer no function, in which the motor simply will not work, at which point the evolutionary process will terminate. It will cease to continue because the system conferring no function will not be preserved and passed on to the next generation.
Behe didn't just challenge the Darwinian explanation for the flagellum in his book, he also offered a controversial alternative explanation, proposing that the flagellum was produced by intelligent design. The flagellar motor and other molecular machines certainly look as if they had been designed by an intelligent engineer. But Darwin and his modern followers claim that the unguided mechanism of natural selection and random variation could mimic the powers of a designing intelligence, giving rise to the illusion of design in nature. Yet, according to Behe, scientists had now discovered irreducibly complex systems in biology that could not be explained by Darwin's mechanism. Perhaps, Behe reasoned, the appearance of design was not an illusion after all.
The question is, how do we recognize design? How do we realize that something has been put together, intended by an intelligent agent? Probably the only real way that you can do it without taking somebody's word for it that they have put something together is by recognizing what's called a purposeful arrangement of parts. Think of, say, Mount Rushmore. You look at the rocks to the left of the images of the presidents, and they don't look like much of anything. And you look at the images, the rocks that are in the shape of the images, and you immediately realize that it was designed. Even somebody who had never heard of Mount Rushmore before from another country would immediately realize that it was designed. And the question is why? Well, because the shape of the rocks are matched to each other. They're ordered, they're put together for a purpose, and the purpose is to portray the image of the presidents. We humans are good at recognizing design. If you go down the street and you see some neighbor's yard that has dandelions around it, and you say, that guy, he should really take better care of his yard. Then you look to the right and you see a patch of tulips, nicely cultivated next to the mailbox or something. You immediately know that the tulips were intentionally put there. Not to get all philosophical here, but if you ask yourself, how do you know you're not the only intelligent being in the universe? It's because you see other people doing intelligent things, like arranging words so that they make sense into books and so on, or arranging paint into paintings, or arranging pieces into machines, or doing intentional activities. It's a very deep part of our own minds, our own intelligence, that we can recognize the effects of the intelligence of other beings in the purposeful arrangement of parts.
Whenever we see tightly functionally integrated systems, we know of only one cause that has produced those features, and that cause is intelligence. That's what we know from experience. And so when we see a feature like that in living systems, given that there's only one known cause of what Behe calls irreducible complexity or functional integration of parts, and that causes intelligence, I think we can reasonably infer that that same kind of cause was at work in the origin of that system in biological systems, and therefore intelligent design isn't just an argument from ignorance, it's an argument based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world, that only intelligence generates irreducible complexity or tight functional integration of parts, and that's what we see in living systems. Therefore, living systems were produced by designing intelligence.